This is Walter Bosley, and I'm going to read a selection from The Complete Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts by Alan Greenfield. The Rocket Scientist and the Guru, Stargate, 1946. And I quote, "At about the same time that Parsons was trying to incarnate an extraterrestrial entity, he also claimed that he had met a Venusian in the desert of New Mexico, an odd foreshadowing of the claims of later contactees such as George Adamski in the early 1950s." End quote. J. Katz, Saucers of the Illuminati. The so-called Babylon working conducted by John Whiteside Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard between January 4th and March 4th, 1946, has been the object of much speculation, mythologizing, and wonder. This speculation is due in part to the involvement of two charismatic and brilliant bohemians of that period. Parsons was a major force in the early development of solid-fuel booster rockets, for which work the International Astronomical Union eventually named a lunar crater in his memory. He was an OTO member from 1941 and served for a short period as Master of Agape Lodge OTO in the 1940s. He died under mysterious circumstances in an explosion in 1952. The other participant, pulp fiction author Lafayette Ron Hubbard, eventually founded the Church of Scientology and has been the center of stormy controversy in the decades since. Both men were students of magic, especially the sexual magic of Aleister Crowley. According to Bent Corridon, Hubbard once confided in his son Ron Jr., quoting, "Secret techniques and powers I alone have refined, improved on, applied my engineering principles to, science and logic. The keys, my keys to the doorway of the magic, my magic, the power, not Scientology power, my power, the real powers of Solomon." End quote. Hubbard Sr. made clear that he was talking about the sex magic central to the OTO system, but with a unique twist. Quoting, "Sex by will, love by will, no caring, no sharing, no feelings. Sex is the route to power. Scarlet women, they are the secret to the doorway. Use and consume, feast, drink the power through them, waste and discard them." End quote. The idealist Jack Parsons could hardly have understood what sort of man he was dealing with here. He wrote Crowley in February 1946, quoting, "About 3 months ago I met Ron. He is a gentleman. He moved in with me about 2 months ago, and although Maggie and I are still friendly, she has transferred her sexual affections to Ron." End quote. While Parsons was convinced that Hubbard, as he wrote Crowley, is in complete accord with our own principles, and proceeded to enter into a joint financial venture with the future father of Scientology, Crowley was writing his eventual successor as OTO Grandmaster Carl Gerner, quoting, "From our brother's account, he has given away both his girl and his money. Apparently it's the ordinary confidence trick." End quote. Parsons' friend Alva Rogers, who witnessed these events as they unfolded, described Hubbard's role in this way. Quoting, "Ron was a persuasive and unscrupulous charmer, not only in social groups, but with the ladies. He was so persuasive and charmingly unscrupulous that within a matter of a few weeks, he brought the entire house of Parsons down around poor Jack's ears. He did this by the simple expedient of taking over Jack's girl for extended periods of time." End quote. It was against this background that Parsons and Hubbard embarked upon the so-called Babylon working, an elaborate sexual magic experiment designed to bring Babylon into physical manifestation. The whole concept of the magical child has several distinct interpretations. In the more orthodox and traditional view, sex magic is employed to manifest by an act of pure will, a magical being, the material basis of which are the sexual fluids themselves. A more literal interpretation holds that magic rituals such as the star sapphire will produce a moon child, that is, a living child who serves as host to a super being. That is, the child is an avatar in Eastern terms, or an incarnation of the divine in Western thought. Yet a third interpretation is that sex magic is simply the yoga of sex, and the so-called magical child is the transformed sex magician himself. Hubbard and Parsons were ostensibly aiming at the second literal interpretation, to manifest a scarlet woman willing to conceive a child who would embody the transformative goddess being Babylon. Crowley wrote Germer, "Apparently Parsons or Hubbard or somebody is producing a moon-child. I get fairly frantic when I contemplate the idiocy of these louts." End quote. The reaction was certainly excessive. Crowley's successor as Grand Master of the OTO in the 1980s, Hymenaeus Beta, noted that an adequate chronicle of Parsons' now famous Babylon working of 1946 EV has yet to be published. Most published accounts focus on his friendship and falling out with the Church of Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, without appraising the larger issues of what was actually being attempted, and why certainly Parsons' own description of the working is based in the fundamentals of ceremonial and sexual magic. In the Book of Babylon, January 4th to March 4th, 1946 EV, Parsons outlines the entire experiment, including the reasons for it. Quoting, "The present age is under the influence of the force called, in magical terminology, Horus. This force relates to fire, Mars, and the sun, that is, to power, violence, and energy. This force is completely blind, depending upon the men and women in whom it manifests and who guide it. The catastrophic trend is due to our lack of understanding of our own natures, the hidden lusts, fears, and hatreds resulting from the warping of the love urge which underlie the natures of all Western peoples, and have taken a homicidal and suicidal direction. This impasse is broken by the incarnation of another sort of force called Babylon. The nature of this force relates to love, understanding, and Dionysian freedom, and is the necessary counterbalance or correspondence to the manifestation of Horus." End quote. Thus far, Parsons is reasoning in a sound manner. Keep in mind, however, that he is working with his so-called friend Hubbard, then himself in the very process of making off with Parsons' money and lover, a man who was to tell his son, Ron Jr., a few years later to use and discard scarlet women. "In what sense scarlet?" the younger Hubbard asked. "Scarlet," the Scientology source replied, "the blood of their bodies, the blood of their souls. Bend their bodies, bend their minds, bend their wills, beat back the past." End quote. This is the grossest perversion of Crowley's teaching. The latter merely observed in the same context, "We do opine that it is better and easier that the other party should be in ignorance of the sacred character of the office. It is enough if that assistant be formed by nature signally for the physical task, robust, vigorous, eager, sensible, hot and healthy, flesh, nerve, and blood being tense, quick, and lively, easily inflamed, and nigh inextinguishable." End quote. Crowley is telling us that a partner in sexual magic should ideally, in his opinion, be involved for the sake of sensual pleasure, pure and simple. Hubbard is telling his own son how to enslave minds, bodies, and souls. Parsons, who wrote extensively on the subject of freedom, could have had no idea what type of person he was engaged in high magic with. In any case, Parsons goes on to narrate that, "In January 1946, I had been engaged in the study and practice of magic for 7 years, and in the supervision and operation of an occult lodge for 4 years, having been initiated into the sanctuary of the Gnosis by the beast 666, Frater 132, and Frater Saturnus. At this time, I decided upon a magical operation designed to obtain the assistance of an elemental mate." End quote. In a sense, deprived of his former lover, Parsons was going for broke, so to speak, and looking for a partner to create a magical child with. All or nothing, I have no other terms, as he put it to Crowley. Beginning on January 4th, 1946 at 9 p.m., Parsons and Hubbard employed the powerful Enochian air tablet, using an air dagger, parchment talisman, invocations, conjurations, Enochian calls and invocations, and appropriate banishings. According to Parsons, at various times over subsequent days, windstorms were raised, electrical power was disrupted, during which Hubbard allegedly had a candle knocked from his hand by something. Several witnesses saw a brownish-yellow light about 7 feet high, which Parsons banished. On January 18, Parsons and Hubbard were out in the Mojave Desert when Parsons suddenly had an epiphany and realized the experiment was accomplished. I returned home, he tells us, and found a young woman answering the requirements waiting for me, end quote. For the next month, he invoked Babylon with her as his partner, as was proper to one of my grade, as he said. In other words, by the sexual Eucharist of the Mass of the Holy Ghost. While his magical partner visited in New York on February 28th, Parsons returned to the Mojave and received a communication he referred to as Liber 49, the Book of Babylon, which identifies its source as Babylon herself. It should be noted that Hubbard was also away then. Liber 49 asserts, among other things, the working is of 9 moons, and she shall wander in the witchwood under the night of Pan, and know the mysteries of the goat and the serpent, and of the children that are hidden away. I will provide the place and the material basis. Thou the tears and blood, thy tears, thy sweat, thy blood, thy semen, thy love, thy faith shall provide. Ah, I shall drain thee like the cup that is of me, Babylon. Let me behold thee naked, and lusting after me, calling upon my name. Let me receive all thy manhood within my cup, climax upon climax, joy upon joy. Gather together in the covens as of old. Gather together in a secret. Be naked and shameless and rejoice in my name. End quote. It is interesting that much of this anticipates the emergence of Wicca at a time when Gerald Gardner in England was only beginning to formulate his ideas. Parsons spent much of the remainder of his short magical career writing on the subject of witchcraft. In any event, when Parsons communicated the good news to Crowley, the old magus was perplexed, or amused, or conceivably both. He wrote to Parsons, "You have completely puzzled you by your remarks. I thought I had morbid imagination as good as any man's, but it seems I have not. I cannot form the slightest idea what you can possibly mean." End quote. Apparently undaunted upon Hubbard's return, Parsons prepared to impregnate his magical partner, impressed by a vision Hubbard had of a savage and beautiful woman riding naked on a great cat-like beast. According to Francis King's account, Parsons was high priest and had sexual intercourse with the girl, while Hubbard, who was present, acted as scryer, seer, or clairvoyant. This occurred on the first 3 days of March 1946. The aftermath is the subject of much rumor and points out the high significance of sexual magic. "This secret is the true key to magic," said Crowley. "That is, by the right use of this secret, man may impose his will on nature herself." End quote. Hubbard took off with Parsons' former partner and the funds of their joint enterprise. Parsons caught up with Hubbard in July of 1946 in Miami, having to evoke Bartzabel to raise a storm at sea, forcing Hubbard back to shore. Ron Hubbard, nevertheless, married Parsons' former lover the following month and went on to write Dianetics, the Science of Mental Health, and eventually to organize the Church of Scientology, built on a hidden mythos of a 75-million-year-old disaster which the inhabitants of a 76-planet galactic federation were blown up by a dictator named Xenu. This science fiction space opera from Hubbard's Pulp Fiction days forms a bizarre underpinning to an already bizarre story. For the rest of it, it depends entirely on whom you talk to. Was a magical child, conceived ritually, March 4th, 1946, born into this world as Babylon incarnate on or about 9 moons later? On or about December 4th, 1946? Is such a being a woman of about 50, alive today? Or was there a more ethereal birth, perhaps on a spiritual level, the true birth date of Gardnerian Wicca and its various descendant bodies, and on a more material level, the birth of modern second-wave feminism? Surely the timing of the Babylon working and the arrival of the post-war baby boom is simultaneous in an eerie sort of way. UFO buffs have of late been touting a theory that Hubbard came to Parsons with a purpose more grandiose than the ordinary confidence game. In pulp magazine circles, he had encountered any number of occultists and border occultists, such as Talbot Mundy, Colonel Arthur Burks, Major Donald Keogh, Ray Palmer, and Richard F. Shaver, and had already formulated the core of the inner Scientology teaching outlined above. He wished to bring this other world into manifestation, but lacked the technical knowledge to do so. So he came to the innocent sex magician Jack Parsons. In this version, the Babylon working, guided by Hubbard, had little to do with Babylon and more to do with the hideous old ones of the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. A door opened, something came through, is the essence of this thesis, and the appearance of the first flying saucer case the following year is considered, in this outre rumor, not coincidental at all. The Babylon working permanently alienated Parsons from Crowley, but the work of the ill-fated rocket scientist has more recently been reevaluated in a more favorable light by present-day occultists and ufologists alike. This is Walter Bosley, and I've just read a chapter from The Complete Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts by Alan Greenfield.